Hey, everybody. It's October, and you know what that means. It's the witching hour here on the Nathan Jacobs podcast. Welcome back, everybody. Actually, maybe it's welcome back to me. As I mentioned in my previous couple episodes, I've been out of the country related to a film project that I'm working on. So I'm now back, and I think I'm over the jet lag. We'll see if I fall asleep during this episode or not. But yeah, here I am. And since it's October, I thought this was a good opportunity to do a theme that kind of leans into the spirit of October. Now, whether or not you celebrate Halloween or denounce it as a pagan holiday that shouldn't be, acknowledged by Christians or whatever it is, however you feel about Halloween, you love it, you hate it, you're somewhere in between, you're indifferent, whatever. Nonetheless, I will admit I love October for a variety of reasons. I love the transition to fall. Fall is one of my favorite seasons. I love as you see the leaves start to change. I love the aesthetic of it. And I have to admit, I love the macabre. And so even the way that starts to come to the fore culturally, where people are sort of intrigued with the paranormal, and that becomes a more sort of prevalent feature of the culture and of the imagination and just of the ethos of the month. Big fan. So anyway, I thought I would lean into that here as we enter October here on the Nathan Jacobs podcast, and do some episodes that at least embrace that a little bit. Now, don't worry, you will still get your rich philosophical and religious discussion that you have grown so accustomed to here on the Nathan Jacobs podcast. But we're going to see if we can put a little bit of a twist on it. So toward that end, my producer, who really enjoys torturing me by throwing out obscure and weird topics from time to time, just to see what I can come up with, how I might start to philosophically dissect it, has decided to do exactly that and offer me some prompts, knowing that what I will do is I'll engage them on some sort of philosophical level. And so I've got prompts here that I'm going to take a look at. Which means I don't really know what today's episode is going to be about. And so we'll find out together. All right, prompt number 1. Let's see what we got. Werewolves and anthropology, discussing moral responsibility of werewolves. Okay. Sounds like a bad academic paper or something like that. Yeah, you go to like an October themed academic conference and you've got a bunch of weird academic topics like this. Okay. Now, lest anybody just tune out and go, man, I'm not interested in werewolves. I assure you the majority of my answer will be about anthropology and about its relationship to morality, given this prompt, not so much about werewolves. But hey, we get the little bonus that at the end we'll circle back and we'll talk a little bit about werewolves. So here we go. Anthropology and werewolves. Okay, so I suppose where I would start with a topic like this is I would want to talk actually about just the nature of anthropology. So let's talk a little bit about sort of the ancient way of thinking about man. And actually, now that I'm thinking about this and the direction I'd like to take this, I think this is actually going to be illuminating for, ironically enough, illuminating for certain aspects of trends in our culture, which is, as you know, something that I really like to talk about. I like to talk about the philosophical stuff and then sort of show how that's relevant to where we're at today. And I think this is actually going to be surprisingly relevant to certain trends in culture today. So anthropology, let's talk about some basic ancient anthropology. So it's rather common in the ancient world to think of man as basically a hybrid, right? A hybrid between the animal and the spiritual. You see this actually in a number of places. You see this in Plato, for example. You see this in the Stoics, and you actually see it in Judaism and Christianity. So here's what I mean by that. So Plato, in his affinity argument for the immortality of the soul, he recognizes that reality consists of really sort of two types of things, broadly speaking. He talks about the realm of being, things that are stable and unshifting, things like mathematics. And then there are other realities that are perpetually shifting and in flux, like organisms, right? And so part of Plato's affinity argument for the immortality of the soul has to do with asking which one of these the soul has a greater affinity for, right? Is it more like the unshifting realities of mathematics, or is it more like the shifting realities of matter? Now, I'm not interested in talking in this context about Plato's argument for the immortality of the soul. What I am interested in here is just the fact that what Plato sees is he sees a bifurcated reality, right? When he looks at the world, he sees two types of, broadly speaking, two types of things, right? Things that are, let's call them immortal, right? And things that are mortal. In Christianity, you'd have to add caveats, right? Relatively immortal, as St. Paul says, God alone is immortal. But nonetheless, there still is that talk of, things like angels being relatively immortal, even in Judaism and Christianity. So Plato recognizes this. And then what he recognizes is that man seems to be this merger of these two types of things. And that view of humanity, where we are a merger of these sort of mortal or animal or, sort of organic realities that are in shift and flux and growth and die, right? We generate and we erode and die, was pretty common in the ancient world. It's central to Stoic anthropology as well. And then it's also central to Judaism and Christianity. If you watch my appearance on my last appearance on Jonathan Pageau's The Symbolic World, I talk a little bit about this, and specifically about the Genesis creation story and how that was seen by the Eastern Church Fathers, as well as Philo of Alexandria before them, Alexandrian Judaism. But the basic idea is that in Genesis, you have things of heaven and you have things of earth, right? The earth is the realm of the organic, of the mortal, right? So this is where God commands the earth to give forth plants. And so plants, come out, right, of the earth. He also then draws animals out of the earth, makes them from the dust of the earth. And then man too is made from the dust of the earth. So man has a certain aspect of us, our fleshly nature, is drawn from the earth, which is symbolically the realm of the mortal. Right. This is why death in Genesis is that, Adam, earth man, right? Earth you are, and to earth you will return, for, from the earth you were taken. So returning to the earth, being taken from the earth and returning to the earth, is the sort of Genesis depiction of generation and corruption, of mortality. And yet you also have this reference to these celestial entities. And oftentimes the heavens or the stars were associated with things like angels or with gods or something like that in the ancient world. And so for that reason, the heaven or the celestial realm was thought of as the immortal, right? This is the realm of the non-organic, immortal realities. And what you see in Genesis is that man is taken from the dust of the earth. So he has, we are part of the mortal realm. But at the same time, what's unique is that God then breathes into man from heaven, and we become a living spirit, is what it says. Spirit here being distinct from soul. Probably don't want to go too far down that rabbit trail, but let's go ahead and we'll just sort of make the basic distinction. In the sort of ancient way of thinking, soul was just the life force of a body. And so you see this in the church fathers, for example. They'll talk about the vegetative soul, right? The Phutikos soul. They'll talk about an animal soul, and they'll talk about the human soul. But spirit was typically used for the rational, right? So that's where angels are referred to as spirits, not as souls, right? And so when talking about man becoming a living spirit because God breathed into him, this is a reference to the fact that we are not just an animal, right? We are an animal that has this rational higher nature, like what you see in the angels. And this is where you get what's known as the microcosm doctrine of the church fathers. It's not just the church fathers, you see it in Philo again, but you see this microcosm doctrine where what we are is that in a broad sense, God has created mortal, realities, animals, plants, things like that. And he has created immortal realities, things like angels. And what you get with man is a merger of these two so that you have in one subject all the things that God has made, right? This merger of the heavens and the earth, of the full spectrum of what God has made. So that's what you find. That's what you find in Genesis. It's what the church fathers recognize in their microcosm doctrine. It's the sort of thing you find in Plato, and it's the sort of thing you find in the pagans, right? You find this type of anthropology, this basic anthropology, in people like Plato and the Stoics and the Neoplatonists. Granted, there's differences, right? In Judaism and Christianity, the soul is an icon of God or an image of God, whereas in certain pagan philosophies, the soul is a divine spark. So there are differences in the anthropology, but nonetheless, there's this recognition that when it comes to anthropology, the nature of man, what you have is you have a higher and you have a lower nature. You have this fleshly animal nature merged with this higher rational, either divine or iconically divine, right? Image of the divine, higher nature. Okay. Now, what this does, though, is this informs, in many ways, a lot of the assumptions regarding morality. Okay. So, a key aspect of morality and moral responsibility in the church fathers, it's ubiquitous in the church fathers, East and West, early on, and early Christian writers generally like Tertullian and Origen, who aren't even church fathers. It's just ubiquitous there, is the idea that moral responsibility requires two things, right? Those two things are that you have knowledge of what you ought to do, and you have the ability to do it or not do it. And if either of those is lacking, so is moral culpability. Now, I think the reason this is ubiquitous in the church fathers is because everybody intuitively knows this. Even children intuitively know this. When a child is caught doing something wrong, they realize that the jig is up, normally what you end up having is one of two excuses, which boils down to, I didn't know, right? And I couldn't help it, right? And even though when we become adults, our self-justification and our defenses become more complex and nuanced and so on, they still kind of boil down to, I didn't know, or I couldn't help it, right? You sit there and you say, well, officer, I where that, the speed limit sign is, I didn't see a speed limit sign. I mean, I've been driving down this road and I didn't see one for miles. I had no idea, right? I didn't know. Alternatively, I was sick. I had this high fever. I was really not myself when I was doing that. I couldn't help it. Right. Your diminished capacity is argument. So in many ways, what happens is whenever we offer a moral defense, our moral defense comes to there is some sort of, unless we're going to argue that somehow the circumstance is different. And so there's an exception here, right? Like the difference between murder and self-defense. We're either going to talk about the material conditions of the event and somehow suggest that it's not really what we're being accused of, or we're going to come down to arguing that there's some sort of diminished knowledge of what I ought to do or capacity to do it or not do it. And if either of those is lacking, that's where moral culpability is lacking. But if you know and you have the ability, then you're morally responsible. And so this is something you find in the church fathers all the time. And it's essential. It's really critical to the anthropology. Why? Because this is the very thing that makes you and I, even though we are animals, right? Man is a rational animal, as Aristotle points out. Even though we are animals, there's something distinct that we have that animals don't have, which is reason and free will. So having the ability to know right from wrong and having the ability to choose right from wrong is what allows moral properties to adhere to our acts, where they don't with regard to animals. So with animals do not have the sort of, irrational animals. We're rational animals. Irrational animals do not have this sort of reflexive capacity. They have reactions, right? Perceived goods and evils that then will kick into certain sort of, reactive capacities that may, involve things like defending my owner or, attacking somebody who seems like bad news or whatever else. But these are not reflexive judgments in the sense that a dog offers some sort of assessment of what is just or unjust, what is right and wrong, and then chooses what is good. Animals act on instinct. And so this sort of acting that happens with animals is animals have, in a broad sense, what are called passions. So this is essential to the basic anthropology, the idea that animals operate by passions. So what are passions? Passions are basically the perception of a good or an evil. And so the idea is this, right? You smell pizza and all of a sudden your body inclines toward it. That smells pretty good. I want that. Okay, that is an animal passion, meaning your body has detected something and sensed that it is in some sense good and desirable, and so it wants it. Impulse toward, let's say you see somebody who's attractive and you have like immediate sort of reflexive, like, ooh, they're desirable. That's an animal passion. Let's say all of a sudden you experience some sort of a threat, right? You're driving down the road and all of a sudden like, woo, somebody like nearly hits you and you react. And your heart starts racing and pumping, and there's this defensive mechanism that kicks in. That's a perceived danger, right? And so that's an animal passion. And so this is kind of the nature of passions. That what passions are that you have a perception, right? A reflexive perception of something either being good and you incline toward as a result, or being an evil of some sort of danger or undesirable, and you recoil as a result. Now, the concept is that that's what animals have too, right? That's your animal nature that is having those animal passions. And this is the sort of thing that you see in Paul. We'll get back to Paul and I'll talk about the moral side of this, but let me finish out this sort of thing. Now, the idea is you being an animal, you have these animal passions, right? You have these reactions. You perceive a good and you incline toward it. You perceive an evil, you recoil from it. But what you have that animals don't have is you have this higher order of reason and free will. So what you have that a dog doesn't have is you have the ability to actually reflect upon the nature of things. You have the ability to look at and assess whether or not pizza is in your best interest as a human being. And you have the ability to say, well, ought I to eat pizza? Is this a good and wise judgment? Is this a just and wise and prudent thing to do? You have the ability to discern a certain order of nature. You have the ability to reflect upon your nature as a human being and begin to assess whether or not this is the sort of impulse that should be acted on or not, right? So if we're talking about food, you have the ability to assess things like whether it is nutritious. You have the ability to assess whether or not it's the sort of thing that is healthy for your body. They're repeating the nutritious part. You have the ability to assess quantitatively. Do you need it? Have you eaten recently? Maybe you don't need to eat right now. Those sorts of things, and make those sorts of judgments regarding, whether or not this is morally and prudentially good or bad for you to act on that. And then to make a choice about whether or not to act on that. So you may have an animal impulse that says pizza is great, it's desirable, I want it. That's what your animal body reflexively says. But your higher nature, your order of reason, is able to sit there and say, well, actually, I've already eaten, so to eat right now would be excess and would be an act of gluttony. Also, if I were to eat, maybe I should eat something more nutritious than that. And so that wouldn't even be the best choice even if I were hungry. So both on this sort of moral level of gluttony and on this sort of just basic care for my body, this is probably not a good idea. So even though my body wants it, my passions incline in that direction, I'm going to say no. Right. And then you make a choice. where you're like, I'm not going to eat it, even though my body inclines toward it. You can do the same thing with, any other animal passion. Whether you're talking about attraction and sexual impulses, whether or not to act on that or not, is this person your spouse? And, there's something morally suitable and appropriate and it's the right time and place and all the rest. Or is it not, right? This person is not your spouse. This person, it's the wrong time. It's the wrong place, whatever the reasons are, whether they're prudential, they're moral, they're both, you end up making an assessment on whether or not that animal impulse is in accord with the order of nature and with wisdom and with justice and all that. And then you make choices regarding to act on it or not. And so that becomes the sort of basic structure of morality. The idea that what you are is you are this hybrid of this higher and lower nature. And what allows your passions to have moral character is the free will aspect. And I say this because it's important to recognize something that the Stoics point out. Your animal passions are not inherently good or evil, right? Your dog might do something like just hump somebody randomly. And if that dog were a human, that would be immoral to just go and hump random people. But you don't look at your dog and think, wow, that dog is immoral, right? He's a philanderer, right? Something like that. No, it's a dog, right? You accept that as a dog, it has sort of a direct through line from passions to act. Right. And that's one of the reasons you have to train animals, oftentimes through reward or punishment, right? Through pain and pleasure. That's how you end up training them, because you're trying to create new through ways to either, sort of deter certain passions and redirect certain passions, create loyalty, to create discipline, whatever it may be. And so with animals, that's how you deal with them. But you don't look at your dog and think it's immoral, right? And it just needs to be trained, right? You need to incentivize it to not behave in that way. Your dog, you might look at your dog eating feces and say like, man, that's gross. And yeah, it's gross, but you don't think it's immoral for doing something like that. It's a dog, right? It just acts on these animal passions. And so the reason that's important is because what makes those animal passions moral or immoral is the addition of the higher nature, the ability to know the good and to choose to do it or not do it. And that's where you have these moral properties imposed on the act. Now, the reason this is important, because this now takes us to a certain structure of morality. And here I'm going to use the Stoics. I'm going to start with the Stoics rather than with the Christians. So within Stoicism, the basic structure of morality as it relates to this anthropology is this. You have what the Stoics would call apatheia, right? Which is basically a first movement of the passions. So let's use an example I threw out earlier. You're driving down the road and all of a sudden somebody cuts you off, right? And you have this reflexive, like your body tenses up, your heart starts pumping, and there is, the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, and there is an impulse toward, well, you might think anger, but the Stoics would disagree. There's an instinct toward self-protection, right? Some sort of recognition that this is a danger, you were nearly harmed. And so there's this sort of lashing out, this impulse to like want to react defensively against something that just threatened your life, right? That's what it is. It's an animal impulse. It's not yet anger, according to the Stoics. Why? Well, because the Stoics recognize that the initial movement of the passions, the reflex, let's call it, is just animal. And so just like with the dog, that reflex is not yet moral or immoral. It's morally neutral because it's just animal. Morality happens when the will, the higher nature, grabs hold of it. And so now you either act on it or you don't act on it. That's where you're getting moral properties. So let's pretend you decide that the desirable course of action is to go ahead and lash out and be like, you son of a whatever, honk the horn, ride their tail, whatever, all that sort of stuff. Now you've engaged in anger, right? Because now we're into moral territory. So the reason this is important is because basically Stoicism, one of the things that it recognized is that sometimes your passions are in accord with nature and sometimes they're not, right? So let's use the example of lust, right? So there's some sort of sexual desire that percolates up. There are certain people with whom that is appropriately directed, certain people, times, places in which that is perfectly in accord with the order of nature. And then there are other people with whom it would not be in accord with the order of nature. So what the Stoics would suggest is that you have apatheia, which is this initial sort of percolating up. And then what happens is the mind and the will engage. And this is where what the job of, the mind is, of reason is to assess whether or not that movement, that apatheia, that first movement of the passions, is in accord with the order of nature or not. Now, let's just say that this is a case where it is, right? This is your spouse and it's appropriate time and place. And so all conditions are right to say that acting on the sexual impulse is in accord with the order of nature. Okay. Now what happens is that is eupatheia. It is a good emotion. Let's translate it. It's a good emotion. But let's just that would be the result, right? So the will grabs it and moves in accord with it. And because it's in accord with the order of nature, it's eupatheia, right? It's good emotion. But let's just take the contrary. Let's say this is somebody who you should not be engaged in sexual relationship with. It's somebody else's wife, for example, or something like that. Now, to assess that and recognize that that is contrary to the order of nature and act on it, that's pathos, right? So this is bad, right? You shouldn't do that, our bad emotion. Now, Stoicism is sort of notorious for apathy, right? When people talk about Stoic, right, he's a very Stoic individual. What they mean usually is that they don't care. They're indifferent, and they show no emotion. That's actually not true to the Stoics. That's sort of this weird sort of cultural misunderstanding of the Stoics, the way it's been popularized. Apathy is what is a word that we get from the word apatheia, which in the context of Stoicism does not mean that you feel nothing, right? It doesn't mean that you're a stone-faced, cold, numb, statue. What apatheia refers to is this gap between the movement of the passions and action, right? So let's give a scenario where there is a lack of apatheia, right? We use our driving scenario. We put in this scenario somebody who is, let's say, culturally, we might refer to them as hot-headed. So we tend to use that term to refer to somebody who just immediately, like the moment something irritates them, bam, right? They see red and they're all flying off the handle and they react. Okay, that is a lack of apatheia. Why? Because they are so enslaved to that passion that there's no buffer between the movement of the passion and the action. So somebody who is hot-headed and lacks apatheia is somebody who, in our scenario, somebody cuts them off, they're immediately like, you son of a, and they start pounding on the horn and they ride the tail, and you're in the passenger seat with somebody like that, and I have been, is really awkward. But you're like, whoa, man, calm down. That is somebody who lacks apatheia. They are somebody who is a passionate person, which incidentally in the ancient world is not a good thing. Being passionate would mean that you're enslaved to your passions, so you lack reason, you're probably immoral. So not a good thing. Anyway, now let's contrast this with somebody who has cultivated apatheia. Apatheia is basically a gap between the movement of the passion and the action, right? What it means is I have cultivated in myself this capacity that when the passion rises up, I pause. Right? I have the ability to take a beat and assess. So maybe the proper order here is to say like, riding this person's tail, honking at them, all that sort of stuff, that's actually not an appropriate or just response. It's not going to draw any good. Maybe, I whether for moral reasons or prudential reasons or both, I decide that that's not actually the right course of action. It doesn't mean I didn't feel the threat of nearly being, run into when they cut me off. I felt it, right? But what happens is as that emerges, right, as that feeling, those passions assail me, because I've cultivated apatheia, I'm able to take a beat and assess, what should I do, right? Rather than just do what the hot-headed guy does and ride their tail. And so that's what apatheia is. Apatheia is that gap. And the importance of cultivating that gap, according to the Stoics, is it allows you the room necessary to not be controlled by your passions and make an assessment of the natural law, the order of nature, and say, what is the best course of action? What is right? What is wrong in this scenario? What ought I to do? So that you are not governed by your passions. Now, I said this is Stoicism, and it is Stoicism. But the fact of the matter is that Alexandrian Jews like Philo of Alexandria, and then Christians like St. Paul and St. James, and then the church fathers after them, tended to actually use a lot of this same sort of thing. Now, the Jews had disagreements with the Stoics about a variety of things, right? They had a disagreement about the nature of the soul. They, had disagreements about their pantheism. They had disagreements on specifically ethical issues, such as the fact that the Stoics thought, if the gods tell you it's time for you to go, you should kill yourself, and that's rational. And so, the Stoics thought that grief was inherently irrational because they were fatalists, and, the rational thing is just to sort of submit to the will of the gods. And you see contrasts with that. The Jews obviously opposed suicide no matter what. They also thought that there was an appropriate point at which you should grieve with those who grieve, to quote St. Paul. So it wasn't as if they completely embraced Stoic ethics, but there is a great deal of overlap between, basically the Jews and then the Christians and what I just described in Stoicism. You see this sort of thing in the New Testament. So St. Paul, let's take, for example, Romans 7. For a lot of folks who maybe, have read St. Paul and they've read the book of Romans, they're familiar with Romans chapter 7, which is a place where Paul complains that, he does things that he doesn't want to do, and the things that I do want to do, I don't do, and all that sort of stuff. And he talks about this war between, depending on the translation, the flesh and the spirit. Or the sin nature, I think is in some translations, and the spirit. And a lot of times folks will be, misled by the translations of that. Certainly sin nature is definitely a misleading translation. If I'm remembering correct, that some translations do that. I think some of them do. But it's also misleading because oftentimes in the context of Romans 7, the translators will capitalize the S in spirit, indicating that it's the Holy Spirit, right? The Spirit of God. But in Romans 7, that's actually not what's going on with Paul. When he's talking about the conflict between the spirit and the flesh, first of all, like flesh is just, sarx, it's just the fleshy stuff attached to your soul, right? It's your animal nature. And in terms of spirit, Paul is plainly not talking about the Holy Spirit in this chapter, because in Romans 7:27, he actually uses spirit interchangeably with nous, which is mind. And for all the Orthodox people out there who are like, it's more than mind. Okay, I understand there's a whole Orthodox doctrine of nous, and in the Church Fathers, it's more than just mind. It's not just intellect, right? But still, it is, a term for mind, right? For this higher nature. And so the fact that Paul is using, basically spirit, pneuma, and nous interchangeably there in Romans 7 indicates that he's talking about the higher and the lower nature. He doesn't introduce the Holy Spirit until Romans 8 when he refers to the Spirit of God, and he adds that addition to it. So the reason this is important is because what Paul is describing is he's describing the very sort of struggle that you see that any Stoic would describe, that you have a fleshly animal nature, and that fleshly animal nature has passions which rise up and assail the higher nature. And oftentimes it overrides the higher nature, right? Even though in your sober moments, you know what you ought to do. There are certain times where the passions, they're really strong, and you give in and you do things you don't want to do. And so this is actually where, Paul, I believe it's in his letter to Titus, he talks about that the job of the Spirit, right? The Spirit teaches us to say no to the passions, right? So Paul talks about the passions quite a bit. In Romans 8, he talks about the same thing, the Spirit of God, who, we put to death the deeds of the flesh by the Spirit of God. So this is Paul's concept that unlike a Stoic, where it's a purely natural, let's cultivate apatheia and let's, through that cultivation, learn to be virtuous people, Paul thinks it's important that God helps, right? That you actually have this supernatural aid, right, of the Holy Spirit at work in the pursuit of virtue. But you see the same thing in James. James will actually, a lot of his instructions, he talks about the passions being the roots of sin, and a lot of the terminology he uses echoes, mirrors, the sort of Jewish appropriation of, or echoing or mirroring of Stoicism. There's a couple of reasons I went through that very long aside on anthropology, aside from the fact that my producer threw out the word anthropology, so this is where my mind goes. There's a couple of things that I wanted to point out here. Let's start with the relevance to a certain trend that I've noticed in culture, and then we'll get back to werewolves. Okay. Yeah, that's what we're doing. Werewolves. Okay. The reason I think this is actually a particularly important and relevant feature of anthropology is because I've noticed an odd trend in culture these days. And that odd trend, I really think it in some ways is traceable at least to Freud. But the idea that somehow the idea was that any sort of denial, self-denial, was repressive. Okay. And so it's interesting that what has sort of crept into our culture is this presumption that somehow the real you is your animal passions, right? That somehow saying no to the impulses that you have is somehow a denial of the self. And what's really strange about this is that it really inverts in many ways the way the ancient world thought. I will say that in terms of like identity and who you are, the Christian view doesn't create a bifurcated, like the soul is the real you and the body is not you. Certain ancient philosophies do, with Plato, right? For example, the soul is the real you. Christianity, by contrast, doesn't really have that view. Maybe we'll talk about that another time, or who knows, maybe we'll get into it in one of the prompts. We'll see. But suffice it to say, that Christianity sees you as body and soul. You are a subject who has a body and who has a soul, and you are not just reducible to your soul. But that said, were there a part of you that is like the real you, it would definitely be, in the ancient world, there would be an inclination toward the higher nature rather than to the lower nature. There would be an inclination to say that rational, higher, free part of you is the more real you. In Christianity, it wouldn't be that bifurcation where it's like, well, the soul is you, your mind is you, right? And the body is not you. That's oftentimes like people will call that Cartesian, right? Thinking that people like Descartes in modernity made the mind the real self and reduced soul to mind and all that sort of stuff. Now, whether or not that's true, that's a longer discussion, but let it suffice that in terms of Christianity and the understanding of, the body-soul relationship, you are both, right? The whole thing is you, right? You are a subject who has a soul and who has a body, has a spirit. And the bigger concern is actually more the ordering of those sorts of things. So it's deemed as, self-evident that the higher things should govern the lower things, that it is suitable that the part of you that has the ability to discern the order of nature, who has the ability to discern the just from the unjust, who has the ability to discern what is wise, the wisest course of action, who has the ability to exercise temperance, who has the ability to exercise courage and things like that, ought to steer and direct the part of you who doesn't have that ability. Because just like our dog, which will go and hump anything that moves, that's not what you want from a man, right? And why don't you want it from a man? Well, because the man actually has the ability to do what a dog doesn't have the ability to do, which is actually to assess the order of nature and determine whether he ought to hump that or not, right? So this is where it's deemed self-evident that what you want is the higher nature to actually order the lower nature. So it's not a bifurcation in the sense that the one of you is the real you and the other side of you is not, right? Like your body is an appendage that we're looking forward to dispelling at death or something like that. That would be more Platonic than Christian. Rather, the assumption is that all of it is part of you. The question is, how is it ordered, right? And the best way in which it should be ordered is where the part of you that has the ability to exercise justice, wisdom, temperance, things like that, is the thing that ought to be in charge, right? Ought to steer the ship, as it were. But it's interesting that what's happened in the sort of worry about repression is that you actually have the opposite taking place, where somehow, if the higher nature says, I ought not to hump that, because that is not in keeping with the order of nature, and so I will not hump that, that somehow that is repression. So what's interesting is that the contemporary inclination, cultural inclination toward, authenticity or self-actualization, things like that, has actually moved in the opposite direction, where what you end up having is, because of this worry about repression, you end up suggesting that the lower nature is actually the real self, like that's the real authentic you. And there's a number of oddities that come with that. The first is that it seems like there's an inclination to think that the lower nature, that the animal passions are somehow just sort of baked in. Like they're immutable. Like they are so authentically you that if you have a certain type of, inclination in your passions, there is no way to retrain it, to change it, whatever. There's also sort of this odd emphasis, again, under the assumption that to somehow say no to the passions is repressive as opposed to important to virtue. You end up having this insistence that you really need to listen to those sorts of things, right? That you ought not in any way to say no to them. And if you do, that is somehow denying the true self, right? You are not being authentic. And so those two things really sort of go together in the contemporary inclination, right? Or cultural inclination towards self-actualization. Where the idea is that the passions are the real you and they are immutably you. And so you really only have two choices. The one is to hide and deny and repress those sorts of things and be an inauthentic person. And then the other one is to grab hold of them and act on them and sort of just give in fully to your animal passions. And that becomes the authentic real you. That's very weird, historically speaking. Especially when you look at it in light of this sort of older anthropology, very classical anthropology. And candidly, like that's only changed very recently. It's not like it's just the ancients that thought this way. This was obviously, a lot of this overlaps heavily with, modern philosophy, even with changes that happen in modern thinking. Like I said, this repression culture is sort of more of a sort of late Freudian type development with the onset of psychology, modern psychiatry. And I think the real difficulty here is that the premises are evidently false. So the first thing that I would point out is that the passions are not actually immutable. So anybody who has undergone some sort of development by choice, let's put aside a moral development. Let's just take a development in terms of, let's say, a talent or a skill. So let's say that you're somebody who has cultivated the ability to draw or paint. Right. Over time, as you cultivate that skill set, what's likely to happen is that your tastes, right? Your perception of certain painting begins to shift, right? You liked certain artists before, and now you see that they're really not as good as you thought. There's certain artists who are very subtle, who you didn't understand why they were great before, but now you understand it. You can see this sort of thing happen in music. As well. And so in music, you start to see people who are, like maybe you loved a certain musician, a certain band or whatever, and then you start to learn how to play an instrument and you start to learn a little bit of music theory. And all of a sudden, this band that you thought was amazing, maybe you're like, I don't know that they're actually that great. And this other, these other folks that you didn't appreciate before, now you have a great appreciation for them. So you see the ways in which those tastes change. Now, let's consider something that, let's take a different sort of skill set like cooking. Now, I've never been trained as a chef. I think I'm a pretty good cook, but I'm not a chef, right? I've never undergone some sort of culinary training. But I presume, based on the report of those who have, that there is an ability, just like with music and with art, to train your palate. And so I hear this sort of thing with regard to chefs, where they talk about as they learn certain things about culinary skill sets and things like that, they start to refine their palate, right? And now the reason I bring this one up in particular is because what you're seeing here is as the higher nature is cultivating a certain understanding and a certain skill set, what it's actually doing is it's reshaping the lower passions, right? Tastes, things like that. And we can see this sort of thing. Parents know this sort of thing with regard to children. The idea that, you and I know, right? Well, anybody who has had kids or had any sort of significant experience with kids know that you can either train kids to like junk food or to like higher foods. Yes, I understand that sometimes it's a bit of struggle. And yes, I understand that sometimes kids are resistant and things like that. But clearly, there are certain types of foods that are more addictive than others, things like sugars and things like that, processed foods, that the more you feed them to a child, the more the child wants them, and the more that sort of passion grows. By contrast, if a child is sort of raised and trained to eat in a certain way, the child doesn't necessarily have the same inclination that he would if you were feeding him processed foods and, packaged foods and, food coloring and sugars and dyes and all that sort of stuff all the time. Right. So there is this ability to train the tastes of children, right, to feed certain passions so that they grow, or, to starve certain passions and redirect them toward other goods. And you can see this also in, the widely reported talk about the way pornography affects the mind, right? The ways in which if you feed this certain passion, it grows, and then it needs, more and more extreme sort of forms of pornography. So as opposed to if somebody is never exposed to those sorts of things, that passion will grow in a different way. The point of all of these is to say that the choices that we make with regard to the higher nature have an ability to affect the lower nature. We can either feed certain passions and cause them to grow, or we can starve them and have them start to diminish. We can also redirect them toward other goods and retrain certain types of passions, right? So this is something that's innate in our experience. And even though we like to talk about, or our culture likes to talk about things like authenticity, we recognize there's points at which this is highly problematic. Take, for example, an alcoholic. Thankfully, our culture still hasn't gotten to the point, I don't think yet, where it would say, no, like alcoholism and just drinking yourself into a stupor to the point that your liver fails and you die, like that's just being your authentic self, man. Thankfully, there's still these certain boundaries that exist. They get pushed out more and more every day. But there are certain boundaries where people recognize, well, like, no, acting on that passion would actually be to your detriment. It's doing physical and psychological harm to you and to those around you, and you ought not to do that. And that's basically, that's how the older anthropology thought about, well, everything, right? So with the alcoholic, what's happening there is that it's so obvious that even in a culture that wants to sort of sanction all kinds of behavior, it's hard to look at the alcoholic who is, destroyed their family relations, who is, killing their body, who is miserable and enslaved to this passion, it's hard to look at that and say, well, that's self-actualization. That's just them being them. That's a good thing. At least that one still hasn't sort of received the blessing of our very permissive culture. But so using that as an example, what you're seeing there is that even the broader culture can recognize the sort of structure of morality that's there in the classical, in classical ways of thinking, that you have a certain passion. That passion is self-destructive. It ought not to be acted on because it's to your detriment, and therefore you should make choices that mitigate against that in order to try to rein that passion in and to reshape it and to starve it and sort of bring it in line with the order of nature. Well, that's basic classical anthropology and ethics. The assumption there, unlike a contemporary culture, is that your passions are not the real you, and they are not immutable. You can reshape them through habit, through exercise of, knowledge, through, growth of various kinds. Just like when you grow in, your skill in painting and your tastes begin to change, as you grow in culinary skills and your tastes begin to change. When you help your kids start to learn to love certain foods that they ought to love, things like this. The presumption in the classical world is that your passions are not the real you and they are mutable. So the idea being that, yes, all of us have different bents. This is actually the basis for what Aristotle calls the golden mean. Right. So the golden mean in his ethics is the presumption that all of us have sort of a different way of leaning. Right. Every tree kind of grows a little bit differently. And the question is, what is the target of morality? And then how does that apply to how do I need to adjust myself accordingly to hit that target? So think about it. Let's use a sort of non-moral example. Windsurfing. I've never actually been windsurfing, but the physics of it seem pretty straightforward. So if I'm a very light person, right? Maybe I'm a 5'2" female who weighs 130 pounds. And I'm windsurfing, depending on the strength of the wind, I might have to lean way far back in order to, hit that balancing mark where I don't get pulled over by the gust of wind against the sail. Now, contrast that with a 250-pound dude. He probably needs to not lean back too far because he could very easily, fall backwards. Because his weight so severely counteracts the wind on the sail. And so that's kind of how the golden mean works. The idea that's, let's say there are certain people who are hot-headed and they really are inclined to they want to fight. Courage actually does not mean that they stoke that impulse. It means it needs to be actually tempered in some way, paired with wisdom and justice. And they probably actually have to learn restraint in order to hit the mark of courage, lest they move into bullish folly. Now, somebody who really, really, really hates confrontation and shies away from it and is very meek and mild, they're going to have to stoke that fighting instinct in order to hit, the target of courage. And so that's sort of the concept of the golden mean. So again, this ancient anthropology recognizes that we all have different bents. Right? We come in. Some people have an inclination to be super lusty, and some people are very tepid, right? Some people are very hot-headed, and some people are very sort of meek and mild. So we all have different bents. And the question is, well, what is the proper order of nature? What ought I to do? How do I reshape myself to adhere to the proper order of nature? And so just like our windsurfers have to behave differently, the dude has to not lean back too far and the girl is going to have to lean back way far. So it is with morality. Our animal passions don't tell us what we ought to do. They're just passions, right? I don't want to say they're totally random, but nonetheless, the presumption is that animals just have impulses towards things that they perceive as good or recoil from things that they perceive as bad. And the job of morality is not to look at those passions and figure out how to be subservient to them and just become a slave to them. The job of reason in the higher order of nature is to actually look at the order of nature and say, I, as a human being, how ought I to live, right? What is the proper sexual order? What is the proper order with regard to eating and health? What is the proper order with regard to courage and fighting or not fighting and things like that? The higher order of man, right, of reason, allows you the ability to go ahead and assess the order of nature. And of course, Christianity and Judaism would add to this divine revelation. You have the commands of God that help illuminate the moral order, as well as to add to it in certain cases, dividing natural law from ceremonial law, but that's a whole nother discussion. Anyway, the point is that the higher nature, the order of reason, is able to actually discern those things. And then the question becomes, now let's assess the passions. Are the passions moving in accord with the order of nature, or are they not? And so there's, on the one hand, there is that sort of immediate thing, my passion rises up, of food should I eat, right? That sort of thing. There's that type of thing. But then there's that broader side that says, well, what is the broad bent of my passions? Am I somebody who has a certain inclination? Well, let's use our alcoholic one, since that's a pretty non-controversial one. Do I have an innate inclination to want to drink to excess that is detrimental to me and to my body and to my relationships? And if the answer is yes, then I need to attend to that. And maybe the answer is, maybe I'm not yet an alcoholic, but maybe I recognize that bent would easily be turned into an overt destructive sort of thing. And so even though for somebody else who really doesn't like alcohol and certainly doesn't have addictive tendencies, for them, they can go out with their buddies and they can drink and it's not a big deal. But maybe I really have trouble, drinking in moderation. Avoiding drinking in excess. And so given my bent, I have to make choices that are different than that other guy. And that was really sort of the way in which it looked at sort of the broader question of morality, because what it meant was the presumption was that I actually can, just like I can train my palate, right? Just like I can train my sensibilities regarding music, just like I can train my sensibilities about art. I have the ability to train my passions. Look, the fact of the matter is, we all know people who have, through behavior, developed certain destructive patterns. They've fed certain passions in a certain way that has created a certain bent that is destructive in their lives. Maybe it's somebody who has porn addiction, a drug addiction, alcohol addiction, some sort of emotional dependency, problem, whatever it may be, right? We all have seen people who have those sorts of destructive patterns. Maybe we are those people, right? But the point is, it didn't start there, right? Those were trained, those were fed, those were developed. So the passions are not immutable. They are mutable and they are shapeable by choice, right? And that's the key part of this, is to say that rather than looking at the passions and saying that's the real me, whatever the bent is, I should lean into that, right? The classical view, as opposed to the contemporary view, is to say it's not repressive. It's not repressive to look at my animal passions and say, those look bent in a problematic trajectory. I should start to reshape those. I should start to prune those. I should start to redirect those in a different sort of way in order to bring them in accord with nature. That's the old way of thinking. The contemporary way of thinking, in our culture at least, is that to do that is somehow repressive, which is really weird, because what it essentially does is it elevates the lower nature into the authentic self. It treats those passions, which are mutable, as immutable. It treats these things that are shapeable and should be subject to a higher order of reason, and brought in conformity with nature, right? This is the man put in charge of the animal to have dominion over it. It makes the man subservient to the animal, where the animal is the one that should be dictating what should be done, not according to reason, not according to a certain pattern of nature, but according to raw, bare, mindless, irrational impulse. And the man ought to, follow along with it, if we're using the analogy of irrational and rational, man as the rational, animal as the irrational. You get it, right? Okay. So that's the strange thing, right? This complete inversion of anthropology. But the fact of the matter is, it's demonstrably false, right? the fact of the matter is that what we can see and what is proven by our experience is, first of all, that the passions are not immutable. They are mutable, and you can reshape them through patterns of behavior, through reason, through understanding, through repetition, through habit. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it is demonstrable that that passions are destructive, that certain passions can go in directions that are destructive to the self, whether because they're out of control or they're contrary to what is in your best interest, and so on and so forth. So the underlying assumption that somehow the passions are immutable, that somehow the authentic self that's saying no to them or trying to reshape them is repressive is kind of, that's crazy, right? But that's where our culture is at. So that's the one commentary I'd offer there with regard to anthropology in our current culture. The other thing that I wanted to talk about then related to this would be werewolves. Okay. I can't believe that's where this is going. Okay. So I'm supposed to make a comment on werewolves. Well, what's interesting about werewolves, and maybe this is this thing that folks who are more interested in symbology would probably really have a fun time with this, is that the werewolf really does sort of represent, symbolically, it let's just say, it really is the representation of that passion that a person has become enslaved to, right? So with a werewolf, what you're dealing with is you're dealing with an individual who has something that comes over them, right? There's a full moon and all of a sudden you transform and you lose control in terms of your self-awareness, your free will, your ability to control the passions. And now the passion, the animal, the lower nature ends up taking over entirely. And the result is destructive. You wake up the next morning, I'm covered in blood. Who did I kill? Who did I eat? What's going on, right? Like all these sorts of things like that. And that's sort of actually the terror. That's part of the terror of the concept of the werewolf, because I actually find it really interesting. Classical werewolf stories, if you look at like the older werewolf movies, like The Werewolf of London or just The Werewolf, the old black and white ones. I think this is actually true also for like the Jack Nicholson one. Jack Nicholson. Which one's the golfer? I always get those mixed up. Anyway, there was some wolf movie, right? I think, which was also a sort of remake. Wasn't a great movie. But anyway, what's interesting is so often the werewolf movies are not so much told, at least the older ones, are not so much told from the perspective of people who are victims of the werewolf. It's told from the perspective of the horror of being the person who has become the werewolf. Right. And this is where I think you do see there a real symbolism of the enslavement to the passions, right? Just like the alcoholic who knows that their will has become so impeded by this passion that it just like a little, you breathe on them and they might sort of fall over and find themselves, racing to get alcohol and get drunk and things like that. And there has been an erosion of reason and of choice such that the passion, the moment it moves and has an opportunity to act, it plows over. It plows over the will. So it's far beyond, right? It's a complete absence of apatheia where the individual has become enslaved to the lower nature and to the passion. That through line is complete, right? Where the lower nature is in control. And so in this sense, I think it's very, very interesting that the werewolf stories, I think what the real terror of the old werewolf stories is that they become a way of us experiencing through, the protagonist of the story, experiencing what it is like to actually be enslaved to a passion, where there's something that has taken over, right? Where there is a lower impulse, a passion that when it takes hold, reason and free will are gone, and the result is that you will do things that when you become sober, you regret and you're horrified by, right? So you become horrified by what you are, right? Because this thing, has taken hold of you and you can no longer restrain it. I'd be very curious to see, and I haven't really looked into werewolf movies. It's interesting that our culture tends to, the way in which some of these stories evolve over time and change over time is sometimes reflective of culture. So I noticed, for example, with vampires, we're not talking about vampires today. I don't think. I haven't seen any of the other prompts, and I don't know how much time I have left for prompts. But it's interesting that, vampires, the older vampire lore, vampires were horrific, right? You didn't want to be a vampire, right? The idea of the vampire was this sort of living death. They were not sexy. Right? They were not that sort of thing. And also there was, a heavy emphasis on the sacramental stuff. You read Bram Stoker's Dracula, I think he's in Romania, right? And so you have, people crossing themselves. Romania is probably Orthodox crossing of themselves, right? You see crosses, right? You see holy water. You see those sorts of that imagery brought in. And so it's very much like this sort of sacramental worldview versus something that is overtly demonic. And yet over time, you see the evolution where you start to see this trope of the vampire being like a cross. That's so silly and ridiculous. And so as the culture becomes, adverse to the religion and pushes it to the margins, so do the monsters, right? The vampires. So that's an interesting trend or parallel there, right? The more where the vampires, rather than becoming a symbol of something that's horrific, where there's a certain type of immortality that's undesirable, they become this weird, sexy thing, like in the Twilight stories. That's really bizarre to me, by the way, because if they're really like a corpse, shouldn't they be cold and unappealing? And anyway, okay. Anyway, so it's interesting the way these stories tend to evolve with the culture. So what I'd be curious about, and I haven't looked into this with werewolves, I didn't do prep for this, right? These are off the cuff prompts. I'd be curious to see whether or not the werewolf stories, as they've evolved over time, whether the werewolves start to be seen as something desirable and good. In other words, the old stories would be more the story of an alcoholic, right? It would be the story of somebody who has something that's taken hold of them, and they recognize that as soon as that trigger is pulled, right, as soon as whatever it is, right, the full moon happens, they are going to lose themselves entirely to this passion and do things that they are horrified by and that they regret, but they also can't stop themselves. That's the nature of the older story. I'd be very curious to see if the newer stories, and I do wonder if there was a hint of this in Wolf, have a bent toward seeing this as, a good thing, right? I'm actually a werewolf. Like, this actually makes me, this is my authentic self, and embracing this lower nature and letting it come out and acting on it and something like that is still somehow desirable. I don't know for sure. I haven't, I can't think of too many werewolf incidents. I mean, other than Harry Potter, where you have Loomis, Professor Loomis, is that his name? Who is a werewolf, and that's obviously not seen as a terribly desirable thing in the books or in the movies. But I would be curious whether or not there's a certain sort of trend. I'm trying to think again of Twilight. I'm inclined to think, like, wasn't it a really great, cool thing when whatever the wolf, I can't remember what Team Edward and Team whatever was. I've never read them. Anyway, whatever. But my vague recollection of that whole Twilight thing was that it was a really cool, great thing when, the wolf went through puberty and all of a sudden was like a 6-pack, werewolf. Anyway, I don't know. Again, it's sort of one of these things where it's interesting to look at the way the stories evolve. But here's what I would say. I would say that what you see in the werewolf in general is that symbol of somebody who has been enslaved by the passions and taken over by it, so that there's not just a lack of apatheia, there's a complete enslavement where the passion can run roughshod over the higher nature. In terms of how to deal with that, I mean, I guess if we're talking about moral responsibility, I don't know, like, are we talking about moral responsibility of the werewolf? I guess so. It would be the same way that an alcoholic is meant to deal with it. I'm trying to think through. I'm not an expert on werewolf lore. Do they is it based on optics? Do they have to see the full moon? I know in movies, oftentimes they see the full moon. Like, if they're asleep in bed and there's a full moon, do they still transform? I don't know the answer to that question. So I'd have to look into it. If you know the answer, you can put it in the comments. But so I suppose the ethics would, in some ways, this would be relevant, right? Do you just like, can you sleep through it, right? You're asleep in bed, you turn into a werewolf. Now you're a werewolf asleep, and then you turn back, and then you wake up, and you had an uneventful night. Or is it inevitable? I think it's inevitable, but I'm not sure. Anyway, the point is this: just like the alcoholic has to recognize that their moment of sobriety is their only chance against that passion, so that it would be the case with the werewolf. The werewolf would need to recognize that he has no ability to stop that passion. He is enslaved to it. And for that reason, he would need to take steps in his sobriety to make sure that even when the passion takes hold, that he can't act out whatever the passion would be. So whether that's putting himself in chains or, locking himself in a prison or whatever, that's the sort of thing. And you do see that type of thing in the older movies, if I'm remembering correctly, where, the person who is a werewolf really wants to take measures to make sure that they are sort of protecting those around them from this enslavement. So it would be with the werewolf, right? The werewolf would have the moral responsibility in his sobriety to take steps and measures so that he doesn't actually act out and, kill anybody when he's no longer sober. And that's the sort of thing that you see in the real world. I mean, somebody who's an alcoholic, that's important that they have sponsors. It's important that they know their triggers. It's important that they do these sorts of things when they're sober, so that when that temptation comes, they have a shot to not give into it and to actually reshape their lives. And that's I guess that's all I have to say on werewolves in anthropology and moral responsibility. Okay, how are we on time? Do we have time for one more prompt? I think maybe we do. Okay. Mummies and personal identity. So it's classics of horror. You know what? I'll just say, as when I was a little kid, I loved classic monsters. So when I'd go to the library, there were these picture books. I wonder if I could still get a copy of these, just for pure nostalgia reasons. But the old black and white, classic monster movies, Dracula, Frankenstein, The Wolfman, Werewolf of London. I didn't really love those movies as a kid. When I watched them, I found them kind of boring and they were disappointing, but I was nonetheless intrigued by the monsters themselves. I was nonetheless intrigued by and loved the aesthetic of it. And so whenever we'd go to the library, the thing I would always get is I'd dig up these books that were just stills from those classic monster movies. And I just checked those out. And I even had little action figures for those classic monsters. I don't know how I got them, but I had a little action figure for the Wolfman. I had one for, Dracula and for Frankenstein. And it was funny, when I was a kid, I ended up one night deciding to bury them in the dirt in the front yard. And then the next day, when I came back, I couldn't find them. So I was like, man, maybe they just got up in the middle of the night and walked away. They are monsters, that sort of thing. Anyway. Okay. So this is definitely a lot of nostalgia for me, talking about the Wolfman and now Mummies. Ooh, and Mummy was not one of my favorites, but, okay. So what am I going to talk about? Mummies' personal identity. Want me to discuss the philosophical question of what makes us across time and physical change. Okay. All right. So I guess this actually does overlap with something that I talked about earlier. So I mentioned as this throwaway, that's a longer conversation. Apparently we're going to have it right now, where I talked about two different things where this came up. I talked about one, that for, Christianity, the soul is not the real you. Like, you are one who has a body and a soul. And I contrast that with Platonism. And I also talked about Descartes and people sort of accusing Descartes or laying at Descartes' feet the idea that somehow the soul is the real self, right? That the mind is that the soul is just a mind, and that the mind is the real self. So let's talk about this. I mean, so I guess here's what I'll say about this. For those who follow me and listen to me, you know I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian. So I guess I'll approach this from, you know, that particular perspective. So one of the things that I think is interesting about the ancient world and its approach to the individual is that ancient philosophy was heavily interested in universals, right? It was very much interested in generics, we might say. So this is the sort of thing, if you've listened to The Most Important Question, if you hadn't, it's a good episode. It's pivotal to so much of what I talk about. That first episode 1. You know that I've talked about realism and the concept of realism versus nominalism. So for the umpteenth time, here's what that distinction is. Basically, in ancient philosophy, they recognize that the mind has a tendency to think in terms of groups. You look out into the world and you see common genera, animal, you see common species, human, you see common properties, bipedal, two-armed, whatever it may be. And the mind just automatically thinks in terms of these structures, in terms of these commonalities. And the question of realism is, why does the mind do that? Is the mind abstracting, pulling out of, or identifying things that are somehow out there and real? Are those generics somehow real? Do you and I really somehow participate in something common? If you say that somehow those structures are part of the fabric of reality, they're real, then you are a realist. If, however, you think they are mental fictions, that the mind is all just generic and disconnected and individual and all the rest, matter floating in motion, matter colliding into each other chaotically, whatever it may be, but the mind needs to organize it in some way. So the mind invents a series of names and sort of starts to create these groups and impose it on reality, but it's not real. They're just names. Then you are a nominalist, from the Latin nomen, for name. And so that's sort of the bifurcation I talk about there. So realism, as I talk about in The Most Important Question, really that was an early question in philosophy, and it comes to sort of win the day, as it were. And so a lot of ancient pagan philosophy became highly preoccupied with this concept of universals or groups, right? The generics, right? What does it mean when we say that you and I are both human, and we're going to say that that's somehow meaningful and real, that unity between us? Part of the question is, well, why is that? Is Plato right? And there's a world of the forms where there's some sort of common archetype that we both resemble. Is Aristotle right? And there's a form inside of matter. What is it, right? That question, the question of universals, really sort of preoccupied the pagan mind. And so much so that what was interesting is that one of the things that was kind of neglected is the question of the individual, right? Of what makes you, you, right, as opposed to me. And you see that, a lot of the ancient world sort of passes over this question with a certain amount of indifference, and maybe not full indifference, perplexity, right? So the Stoics talk about, well, maybe you have some sort of an idiosyncratic property that's, like a non-repeatable, and it's what makes you, you. Aristotle sort of defines it negatively. When you run out of generics, whatever you get down to at the end, when you're done talking about common properties, that's the individual. And so you had like these sort of things where it's either passed over in silence, or it's defined negatively, or it's sort of speculatively dealt with, like an idiosyncratic property or something like that. But really what you see is in the Eastern Church Fathers, especially, but the Church Fathers generally, but especially in the Christian East, you see the development of this need. It's not just a development. It's a need to explore the concept of the individual. And this is largely prompted by the fact that the Christians believed in the Trinity and they believed in Christology. And those doctrines required them to develop a fully robust Christian concept of the individual and the ontology of the individual subject, right? And the reason is because when you're talking about the Trinity, for example, you're talking about a common nature, and then you're talking about several subjects who share that nature. So what does that even mean, right? If you're going to coherently discuss that distinction, you need to actually talk about what a person, even though that's not really the best translation of it, of hypostasis, but we'll see if we get to that. Like, what is that, right? When we say several persons, what is that? And then similarly with Christology, right? If you're going to say that there's one subject or person who has two natures, divinity and humanity, like, what are you really saying? And so it's interesting that those doctrines forced the Christians to articulate and think about the individual subject in ways the pagans didn't have to. Why did they have to? I mean, it would have been, sure, a point of curiosity, but it wasn't in any way sort of like a philosophical necessity for them. So the Christians are sort of forced to grapple with that. And it's also interesting, and I think this actually really in some ways illustrates very well the relationship between faith and reason in the Christian world, which is that even though they're engaged in philosophy, it's kind of like they have a cheat sheet, right? In other words, the things about the Christology and the Trinity, the truths about those doctrines end up providing certain guidelines, certain guidance in terms of what must be the case, right? In other words, reason provides a certain amount of data, but there may be certain bits of data that are beyond us, right? That are beyond reason. And so when God sort of reveals those sorts of things, that offers you a new bit of data to help you flesh out the picture. And you see this sort of thing at work in the Trinity and the Christology. For example, when it comes to the Trinity, one of the possibilities that you could say is that what a person is, or what an individual subject is that it's matter, right? And so we could be Platonists and we could say, well, sort of like, I am a copy of the archetypal form of human. And so what I must be, what the individual, what the subject must be, is just sort of like a lump of matter that then takes on these properties. And so you could make it material, for example. That's one possibility. But the thing is, if you're going to say, well, the Trinity involves, several persons or subjects, well, that becomes a non-option. Well, the material, because God's not material, that one's off the table, right? And then maybe you're like, well, maybe it's just a phenomena of a conglomeration of various properties. And so it's an emergent sort of, cluster theory of this unique, non-repeatable cluster of properties. If you could repeat it, you would have me, but you can't repeat it for whatever reason, and so therefore it's just a cluster phenomena. I'm very tempted to make some sort of joke about a cluster, but anyway. So when it comes to the Trinity, no, again, because God is not seen as having these sorts of accidental traits of size and position and location, and so on and so forth, that sort of cluster theory of a person or a subject becomes problematic to apply to God. So what's interesting is these doctrines end up offering some sort of guideline, some sort of guardrail that says, well, this one wouldn't really work, right? If it's true that there's a Trinity, this one wouldn't really work. If it's true that there's an incarnation, this really wouldn't work. And so it's sort of fascinating the way in which Christian philosophy is able to demonstrate, and the Eastern Church Fathers especially, it's able to demonstrate the ways in which faith and reason, the truths of nature and the truths of revelation come together and harmoniously move the philosophy forward. So anyway, that's just an aside. So with the Eastern Church Fathers, what you end up seeing is you see a couple of different things. First of all, you see a tendency toward a form of moderate realism. Now, moderate realism, as contrasted with extreme realism, these are sort of labels that, they have some problems. I talk about a little bit about why I think they're problematic labels in the opening of my article. I think it's in the introduction of my article on the metaphysical idealism of the Eastern Church Fathers. But I'll just use them as a shorthand because they have a certain utility to them. So if you think about Raphael's painting, School of Athens, you see at the center of this painting, right? If you've ever seen that painting, and if you haven't, look it up. At the center of that painting, you see Plato and Aristotle. And they're both doing different gestures. They're standing next to one another and talking. And Plato is pointing up, and Aristotle has his hand extended out. Okay. And the reason Raphael does this is because that's meant to illustrate two different theories of realism. they're answering the question, where are the forms, right? So the forms or the universals, right? The things that we've said are real, right? If we're realists and we're saying, well, the generics, the common properties, those things are real, they're part of the structure of reality. Well, what are they? Where are they, right? And Plato's saying the forms, and he's pointing up. In other words, he's pointing to a second world, a world of archetypes or the forms. I talk about that a little bit in The Most Important Question, but suffice to say that Plato, at least as traditionally read, believes in a second world that consists of the archetypes that our world is a copy of or a mirror of. Okay, moving picture of. Aristotle, by contrast, thinks that the forms are here. They are embedded within matter, and that's why his hand is extended out. He's saying the forms, right, out there. And so I tend to use as an illustration, like taking a piece of fabric and wrapping it around a ball, and the fabric has the potential to be spherical, and then wrapped around the ball, it takes on sphericality, right? And that's sort of the form-matter relationship, where Aristotle thinks that matter is this sort of amorphous potential to be any number of things, and that what material objects are is matter, where certain properties manifest within it. And so that's where everything is hylomorphic, hyle being hule being, matter, and then morphe being form. So hylomorphic, it's a form matter composite, right? This material potential taking on concrete properties that gives you a concrete thing. Now, that's the extreme realism, moderate realism distinction. Now, with the Eastern Church Fathers, you end up seeing a tendency toward moderate realism. We can see this in Epistle 38 of Basil of Caesarea's corpus. There's controversy whether Basil wrote it or Gregory of Nyssa, his brother, wrote it. Doesn't matter. It's a matter of indifference to me because I think they agree. So let's put aside authorship. What is generally agreed on is that when hypostasis, which is the word that ends up being used to talk about the several subjects of the Trinity, what in English is typically referred to as person, which is not a great translation because prosopa would be persons. That would be the one that you'd probably want for that, but that was associated with Sabellianism, which is mask. So hypostasis is really something else. That's why I tend to use subjects, but whatever, forgive the aside. The point is that whenever people talk about the doctrine of the Trinity as formulated at Nicaea and then Constantinople being the one where the hypostasis doctrine is defined, that's where you get the three persons and one nature, if you've ever heard that about the Trinity. And so the terms there, the Greek terms there, are like ousia, which is the nature or the essence of the thing. And so like my nature or essence is human. And then hypostasis being the several individuals. So I'm identified by name, right? So I'm Dr. Jacobs, right? So Dr. Jacobs is the hypostasis, ousia, my nature is human, right? So that's the terms being utilized there. Now that distinction between those terms doesn't emerge until the Council of Constantinople. Nicaea establishes that the persons have a common nature. And then Constantinople establishes the terminology of hypostasis to distinguish them. And I say it establishes the terminology because prior to that, just in the Greek language, ousia and hypostasis were interchangeable, right? They were synonyms. And so people use them interchangeably, and the church fathers acknowledge that becomes a point of confusion. So as they often did, they're like, okay, we've got to establish some terms, and from now on, as Christians, we only use these terms in a certain way. And so they institute this sort of change in language to make sure that there's clarity. And the clarity is that the persons of the Trinity have a common nature, ousia, and then they're going to use the term hypostasis to refer to the enduring subject. Now, the reason Epistle 38 is important is because it's the first letter where you're really starting to get, in leading up to Constantinople, you're starting to get hypostasis, as it's going to be used in the council, in the doctrine of the Trinity, defined. And what's interesting is that the reason for the terminology, and there's prior precedent in people like Origen, who against the Sabellians had said, used hypostasis in a way that's sort of analogous to what I'm about to say. So there's precedent for it. But in Epistle 38, basically what it says, I'll just say Basil, what Basil says, is that he suggests that a nature or an essence is a pure abstraction, right? You never just see generic human floating out in the air. And so it has no stasis, right? It has no stability. It has no concrete reality in itself, such that it might just float out there in the air. And so that's why what it needs is a hypostasis, right? It needs something, an individual subject underneath it who has it, right? And so that's where what you get with the hypostasis doctrine is the idea that somehow what you are is the subject is the enduring entity underneath all the changes. And so I, Dr. Jacobs, am, a non-repeatable, enduring subject who has a nature, human. I have material that's in flux. I have various accidental properties that pass through that. Because of my complex nature, I have a body and a soul. And, with my body, I also have, all the different organs that go with it and so on, right? So what I am is I am that enduring subject underneath that gives concrete stability and endures throughout the change underneath it. Okay. Now, the importance of this doctrine is that concept of the individual starts to cut against and inform in some ways certain ways of thinking about features of the individual and of the body-soul relationship and things like that, as the Christians go on and have conversations about these things. And it's ironically relevant to things like mummies and personal identity. So what's interesting is let's think, for example, of, let's pretend that somebody comes in, there's an axe murderer because it's October, right? And so with Halloween approaching, the axe murderers are out in force. And so one races in and you see me and it's like, oh no, right? And he comes up to me and I try to shield myself and he chops off my arm. And so then I fend him off, but I dutifully finish the podcast. But I'm sitting here, with my arm bandaged and then my forearm is over here, right? The question is that still my arm, right? And what's interesting is, if you have a mere proximity notion of the individual, right, where what makes something you is that it is in close proximity, or you have a mechanical view of identity where it's because it's wed to you, you would kind of have to say that's not my arm, right? Because it's no longer attached to me, right? That's the sort of language we would use. But that's not actually how the church fathers think about it, right? Because the fact of the matter is that the idea being that what brings about this forearm, right? What gives stability to this particular matter and the reception of these properties and the concrete reality is me, the individual who has all of it, right? And so the fact of the matter is, even though it's not attached, there is a clear sense in which that is my arm, right? Even though it's detached from my body, because its stasis and its stability originates with me, right? I am the one who undergirds that. And so this is actually part of the reason why that even though when it's detached from me and now it's detached from the life and it begins to erode and die and, sort of rot and whatever else, it still has, because of its, it derived concrete existence from me, it's still my arm. And this becomes part of the rationale for the idea, if the soul leaves the body, right, that is still your body. Now it's your dead body, right? Your dead body in the sense that the soul has left it and no longer has a life force. The material that, received these properties is going to begin to release those properties and it's going to erode and die. But in terms of, origin and stability and concrete reality, it derived that stasis from you, right? You are the one who provided that stasis to it. And so this is a view that moves contrary to the notion of proximity. And this is why, the church fathers, the Eastern fathers talk in terms of when a saint dies, right, that their body is still their body. Or specifically, you can look at John of Damascus and talk about the way in which Christ's body is in the tomb. Well, it's still his body, even though his soul is now entered the realm of the dead, Hades, that his body is still in the tomb, and it's his body, right? It belongs to him. It belongs to that hypostasis. And so that's what's sort of intriguing about this, because unlike a proximity view, which suggests that what makes it me is that it's attached, this is the notion that what makes it me is that me, the enduring subject underneath it, is what provides the stasis and concrete instantiation of this set of properties. That's what makes it, me and mine. And so what's interesting here is you could do, we're not talking about cyborgs because that's not like the prompt that I got, but, there's a sense in which what's intriguing is that here, if you said like, well, let's say I removed, I lost an eye and I got some cyber, eye, is that me? Well, the answer would actually be no, because just because it's in my head or attached to me, that proximity isn't what makes it me, right? Just like these clothes, are not me. They're in close proximity to me. They lay atop me, right? They drape me, but they are not me, because proximity isn't what makes it you. What makes it me is that I am the one who has given concrete instantiation, right? I'm the enduring subject who has and gives concrete instantiation to a certain type of nature. And so the fact that the nature is human, and then the accidental properties that move through it, the materiality of it that it possesses, and so on, that is the thing that makes it me, right? That is the thing that makes it my body. That's the thing that makes it my soul. That's the thing that makes those properties, as accidental properties, part of me, and so on and so forth. Now, the reason I bring this up is because when you're talking about mummies and personal identity, I suppose we could also apply this to zombies too. There's a real sense in which the mummy is actually, that is the body of, whoever had that body, right? So it's King Tut, right? I don't know. Let's pick a mummy. So we've got King Tut's, the mummy of King Tut. Well, that is the body of King Tut, right? His soul is no longer in it. And that's why it's eroding and it's dying, because the life force that holds it together and vivifies it is absent from it, has been separated from it. But nonetheless, the body still belongs to the hypostasis that gave rise to its concrete instantiation. It's still the body of that. And that's also the concept. That's why Christians believe in resurrection as opposed to reincarnation, right? Resurrection is actually the reassemblage and, repairing of the soul with the body, not a new body, right? You don't give them a new body. That would be reincarnation, right? Where the soul leaves one body and takes on a new body. There's a belief in Judaism and Christianity in resurrection, continuity, right? You get the old body back because that's your body. It's part of you. And so that would be sort of, I guess, what we'd have to say, where the mummy really is that. Now, there is kind of an oddity here, both in mummies and in zombies along these lines, which is that the horror of it, well, okay, yeah, sure. Let's go down this road. Okay, so there's first sort of a weird philosophical dimension of it, where I fear the concept of the mummy, right, where this dead body sort of wanders around, similar with a zombie, is that you're dealing in almost a formal contradiction, because the concept is that you have a dead body, an inanimate body, right, a dead body, where the soul, right, has left the body, anima, right? The soul has left the body. So that's why it is no longer alive. That's why it's no longer moving. But then it reanimates, but without the soul, right? So that's kind of the weird horror of it. When you look at a zombie, what's really sort of strange and unnerving about the zombie, put aside whether it's gross, right? Like obviously there's like weird, it's rotting, it's gross, that sort of thing. But what's really unnerving about zombie films and about the very nature of a zombie is that the mind still recognizes, from the extrinsic properties, still recognizes human, right? It still recognizes, okay, all my faculties are telling me this is a human. And actually, it's more unnerving when in these stories, it's someone you recognize, right? So I think, for example, of two different things. I think about season 1 of The Walking Dead. I'm trying to think. what is the guy that Rick, the black guy and his son who Rick meets early on after he's out of the hospital? I can't remember his name. He comes back later in a later season. But anyway, I know that there's a storyline there where it's his wife slash his son's mother who ends up turning, and he just can't bring himself to kill her. And that becomes this like whole emotional storyline. Like, that's brilliant. Also, you see the same thing. I remember when I was a kid, so I was into horror movies when I was a little kid. And I don't know if my parents knew that I was watching them or not. But I remember watching Pet Sematary. Wow. When I was a kid, that disturbed me. And it really disturbed me because if you don't know the story of Pet Sematary, right, like it's the cemetery where if you bury things, they come back alive, but they're not really alive. They're, sort of zombie, horrifying versions of themselves. And the thing that really, really, really got me in that movie, disturbed me to no end as a child, I don't really remember how old I was, is that the dad at some point loses his son and he decides to bury his son who comes back as a zombie. And just like, even as a kid, I understood how messed up and disturbing that was. But I think that's really the sort of thing that is really most troubling about these sorts of zombie tales. I'm sorry to transition from mummies to zombies, but there's a parallel there. I mean, is the only difference that one is wrapped up and from Egypt? I don't know. Anyway, but the point is that what's really disturbing and troubling is that the mind can't stop recognizing the person. And for that reason, associating the person, because epistemologically, we don't look through the flesh to the soul itself, right? We infer, right, what is on the inside from the outward expression, right? From the accidental properties, from the articulation, the energies. I talk about this in my AI episode. And so epistemologically, that's how we come to know something. And so it would be very difficult in a zombie scenario where this real, that somebody you love and has died and suddenly reanimated to not associate that with them, partially because it is their body, but also because they're animated now. So you might recognize something's wrong, right? The mind is not present, things like that. But it's that weird association that makes it so unnerving, where you're seeing the person, but all of the humanity is gone, right? Like, that's what's really disturbing, that the ability to recognize you is gone. The ability to make free choices is gone. The ability to show love and compassion is gone. All of the humanity is gone. And all that's left is an animated body that consumes. But you can't stop associating that animated body in these sorts of stories where it's somebody with the person you knew. And that's the thing that's really so unnerving about it is, and I suppose here you get something that's analogous again to the werewolves, right? The werewolves becomes almost symbolically analogous to the alcoholic. This would be similar to seeing somebody who has gone so far down a certain road into the pit of hell, so to speak, that they've lost themselves, and you can't, like, you know who they are, you know who they were, right? But you can't sort of shake, and you can't shake that. But the fact of the matter is, what's standing in front of you is not that, right? All that was, all that you recognized as good and lovely and human about them seems to have gone away. All right, so that's sort of the thing that's most unnerving about those sorts of stories. Now, I said there's also a philosophical problem, and that philosophical problem is that in some ways, what the entire concept of a mummy or a zombie is a reanimated dead body. And that's kind of a contradiction in terms, because in the ancient anthropology, as I talked about, what makes a body alive, what makes it animate, is that it has a soul. Right. So this is one of the reasons why the basic concept of soul in the ancient world is just the life force of a body. That's why a plant, which grows and is alive, has a soul, a futuka soul. That's why an animal, which grows and is alive, it has a soul. A bug, it has a soul. And humans, we also have a soul because we have an animal body that is animate. And so it's sort of a weird thing to be like, well, it's got a soul, but its soul is gone, right? And that's sort of the bizarre thing about like the mummy and the zombie concept, which is that what you have is a reanimated body. So I suppose to avoid the contradiction, you would have to go with one of two things. One possibility is it's animated by something other than a soul. And so here you could suggest that it's demonic, right? There's some other spirit, some sort of dark force that's animating it that is not a soul. And in this sense, it's an animated body, animated extrinsically or internally, I guess, if it's possessed, something like that. The other possibility would be, and I don't know that this actually would work metaphysically, but you could say that, well, only the animal part of the body is back. Although it doesn't seem to be that, because the body is still rotting. It's still like dead. And so I think that one's more problematic. It's also problematic because the soul is not an organism where it has parts where you can sort of separate out the rational part from the animal part and just send back, the animal part. So metaphysically, that one's more problematic. So you're probably talking about, if you're going to make this plausible, some sort of dark animation, which actually fits probably closer with Pet Sematary, that whatever's going on with the reanimated corpses, it's not good. So anyway, but nonetheless, I suppose, since the question is, what makes us us, right? There you go. That's the sort of doctrine of the hypostasis. And the mummy or the zombie actually is the body of the deceased person, but clearly the person, like the soul, the rational part of the person, is no longer there, and they're being animated by something else, something that's apparently pretty dark. And so, boy, hope that doesn't happen with my body. My body ends up just animated by somebody to come back and eat people. Thankfully, that seems implausible. Okay, so there we go. I'm probably just about out of time. I'm kind of just want to glance. I want to see. I got 3 prompts, and I only made it through 2 because, I did. Let's see. Doppelgangers and the self. Oh, that's related to it. Exploring theories of personal identity and the philosophy of exact duplicates. Now, that's funny because I've been writing my book on Leibniz of late, and Leibniz has the doctrine of the indiscernibility of identicals, which is to say that if 2 things were actually identical in every way in the properties, they'd be the same thing. That goes into a theory of identity that Leibniz holds. Anyway, suffice it to say, I'll just say this. Since I already talked about the hypostasis doctrine, and this is closely related, I'll say this. I think the problem of suggesting that, first of all, I don't think you can have exact duplicates, because I think where I'm sitting, how I'm positioned, these are properties. And so even when you're talking about an exact duplicate, I don't think that's a real thing. So even if I looked across the way and there was my doppelganger and it's an exact duplicate in the sense that you couldn't tell me and him apart, the fact of the matter is that we would have distinct properties. He's over there, I'm over here. So you'd have that. So I don't think the idea of exact duplicates is actually a meaningful concept. I think what's meaningful is the idea of common enough properties that an onlooker can't tell them apart, right? That's meaningful, but exact duplicates I don't think is a real thing. I don't think identity is rooted in properties. So I think actually the doppelganger scenario is one of the things that actually shows the wisdom of the hypostasis doctrine, because if all I were just a cluster of properties, I'd be repeatable. But we recognize that it's sort of self-evidently true that were there somebody who had all of my exact properties over there, that he would not be me, right? That there is a difference between the original and the replica. And so the fact that he is a replica and not me indicates that I am something, whatever makes me is something, some ontological reality that is not just this particular set of properties. So I actually think the doppelganger scenario ends up reinforcing the concept of the hypostasis, the concept that somehow underneath all these properties and this nature is an enduring self, right? Some sort of ontologically real, idiosyncratic, non-repeatable subject that has this set of properties over here, right? And is not that guy over there. It's not a universal, it's not a generic, it's not something that can be repeated such that you give somebody else the property of being Dr. Jacobs and they're not Dr. Jacobs. It's a non-repeatable, discrete, identity, a hypostasis, if you will. Let's just use that term. So anyway, all right. Well, hopefully this was not a complete waste of time. I think we talked about some pretty good stuff. I don't know how much it puts you in the October mood, right? With our talk of werewolves, mummies, zombies, and doppelgangers. But, hopefully it scratched a little bit of that itch while still giving you a deep and rich insight into certain things about philosophy, religion, anthropology, ethics, where we sit in our culture today. So let me know what you thought about this episode. This was definitely outside of the box, and I suspect we're planning on doing at least one more like this, unless everybody hates it. In the month of October, we also have some other things that are sort of thematically coming up. I do an interview with an Orthodox priest who has ample experience with the paranormal and exorcism and things like that. So we got a couple other things coming up for the month of October unique to it. But let me know what you thought, right? Did you like this? And if so, we'll do at least one more with some of these odd October prompts. So there you go. That's it for today. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, all the good stuff. And we'll see you next time. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.